Well, shall we get started? There's a lot to cover and not nearly enough time. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the CLP, Center on the Legal Professions Speaker Series. I see some familiar faces in the room, so I realize many of you are familiar with the kinds of things that we cover. I'm Heidi Gardner. I teach a course here called Understanding Law Firms as Businesses. And so if you're interested in this, small plug, if you're interested in the kinds of topics we're going to cover today, these sorts of issues, and the kinds of illustrious speakers, then I'd invite you, if you're a 1L or a 2L, to come check out the course next year, because this is exactly what we dive into. But we are so lucky today to have Roger Meltzer here with us. He is probably better equipped than almost anyone on the planet to talk to us about the future of big law. By way of background, I won't take up too much of the time, but by way of background, he joined the firm, DLA Piper, in 2007 as the global chair of the corporate and finance practice. And he's moved up through various ranks of the global board, the U.S. Executive Committee, and in the coming January, he'll be the global co-chair of the entire firm, along with Nigel Knowles in the UK. And so DLA Piper, as I'm sure you're aware, is a family of law firms that have joined together. The global reach is massive. It has challenges and opportunities that are beyond compare in some ways. And I'm so looking forward to what Roger will tell us today about the future of big law, the law firm of 2020, and what it means for you and for all of us. So thank you, welcome.
Thanks, Heidi. Thank you all for coming. Heidi said to me, you don't have a PowerPoint. I never operate with a PowerPoint. I don't know whether that's good news for you or bad news for you. I very often do these without notes because it's so embedded in what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. So just a little bit more background so you have an appreciation of how far I've come. I was at Cahill, Gordon, and Rindell for 30 years. It was the only legal job I had before I went to DLA. I really thought I was a summer associate at Cahill. I ended up being on the executive committee. I had a pretty substantial practice. And part of the, come in and sit down. Don't be shy. Come in and sit down. And I really had a sense that there was a shift going on. There was a huge paradigm shift. And one of the things that's happened in big law, I think, is the question of people looking at the future and how various things are going to impact it. And there invariably is a watershed event that happens to a law firm. So let me give you a few examples. I can give you some historical examples. Skadden Arps, when I started out, had 75 lawyers, 30 of which were in Boston. They knew nothing about M&A work at all. And Joe Flom captured people's, when the adoption of the Williams Act, Joe Flom captured people's imagination and built a powerhouse as a result. So there was a practice that changed big law. Secondly, you look at a firm like, let's say, Schulte Roth. Paul Roth was a guy who was doing pretty small equity deals in New York in the capital markets until he came upon the idea of the hedge fund and hedge fund regulation and made Schulte Roth a powerhouse. So there were some firms, and for Cahill, frankly, it was the representation of Drexel in the 80s, which spawned a leveraged finance market that ended up changing the face of how everybody does deals, private equity. I mean, all of these things that you hear now as part of common parlance, it didn't exist in the early 80s. So you have shifting paradigms. So what shifted now? Well, what shifted now, every one of these firms has had a watershed experience. For DLA, the watershed experience was the evolution of the notion of the global firm. And for a long time, people said, gee whiz, these firms, how are these firms going to stick together? They're going to blow up because they all have, they were a true merger. It wasn't a takeover as many law firm transactions are, as you've seen now, whether it's Patton Boggs or it's Hogan Lovells or it's Norton Rose or it's any of these firms. A lot of these are really takeovers and restructurings of, you can see things may happen at Bingham. There are a whole bunch of these things that are going on that are really restructuring of law firms where the economic model has failed. So how come we were able to build this, and particularly build it at a time during the financial crisis? I mean, you think about it, this firm came together in 2005, had a couple of golden goose years from 2005 through 2007, and then the world blows up. Largely because people were people of goodwill. And people understood also that they were really onto something, and they captured a wave. And there were prominent practices, and there were things that were done. And one of the very important things that happened to DLA was Couder Brothers, which was among the first international global firms, went down. So you had all of these practitioners that were on the loose. And they were in Singapore, and they were in Bangkok, and they were in Milan, and they were looking for a global firm. We validated the proposition of the global firm, and in fact, many people thought that it was going to blow up, and if anything, it's gotten stronger and stronger, and you can see all of these other situations in which the global firm has been validated. So DLA is now the actual DLA is in 30 countries, 77 offices. There are about 4,000 lawyers. There are 1,300 lawyers in the U.S. The revenues of the firm are about a little bit north of $2.5 billion. We believe that there will be at some point, come in please. There will be a $5 billion law firm. Because we think that ultimately the paradigm will shift in such a way, and the regulatory environment will shift in certain countries, particularly China and India, that will result in DLA becoming a $5 billion enterprise, or maybe even a $7 billion enterprise. Because you can't be global and not have a very significant Pan-Asian component to it. Now, particularly in a place like India, I mean, the democratic chaos that goes on in a place like India is so extraordinary, and the embedded desire of the bar to keep everybody out, sort of similarly to Brazil, is problematic. But look, the reality of it is that we're pretty smart guys, not only us, but all the people who are building global firms, and we know how to manage in a global environment against the embedded local firms. I'll tell you just sort of one anecdotal story which will give you an idea of what my life is like on a regular basis. We have a global board, and there are some pretty interesting luminaries on the board. Senator Mitchell is obviously the former chairman of the firm. Senator Daschle is very involved, but one of the most interesting new people to come on the board was President Aznar, former president of Spain, obviously a luminary in South America. So he was very focused on our Mexican operation, our Venezuelan operation, our Brazilian operation, and he wanted me to go with him to Colombia. So I go to Bogota with President Aznar, and President Aznar being President Aznar, we end up being in the presidential palace with President Santos and a whole bunch of fat cat lawyers and big industrialists. So you have, for example, 40 million people, roughly, an economy that's completely on fire, very wealthy families, They don't have any antitrust rules in Colombia, so these families control, and they're all interested in outbound global work because they can't get the returns in Colombia that they would like to get in the rest of the world. So President and I were leaving after an interminable dinner, and President Aznar goes to the men's room, and I'm left with President Santos. And I'm thinking to myself, what is going on? So he pulls me aside and he says, you see all those fat cat complacent guys sitting in that room? We know that our industry and these important families need to have a global firm competing with our local firms. We know that you are not going to do the local work of Colombia. Obviously, we're not going to do that. But the outbound work needs to be done by global firms if it's going to be done at the highest levels. So then he just looks me straight in the eye. Remember, this is a guy who's negotiating with the FARC. He looks me straight in the eye and he says, when are you opening in Bogota? Look, I'm not a guy who's, generally short of words and so on and so forth, but this is the president of Colombia speaking to me, and I'm thinking to myself, internally, how can I get this done in a period of time? So I said to him, late fall. So he said, oh, late fall, you mean November 15th? So I said, oh, okay, I mean, that's possible, but that's the kind of thing that goes on with the global firm. So let me just sort of give you an idea as to why all of this stuff is so important. The market, the demand for legal service. So what's happening in your life that's likely to happen? The demand for legal services is flat. Maybe it's an increase of, let's say, 1 to 3%. You may see an uptick this year, but the uptick, don't be fooled by the uptick. The uptick is largely caused by disruptors in the market. Disruptors in the market are, you've heard of Axiom or Pangea 3 or Practical Law or whatever they are. They are not doing what you're doing. They don't even consider their clients or the people that pay them money clients. They consider those people to be customers. They don't consider the hours or the advice that they give as sort of legal advice and being the trusted advisor. They consider them to be production units. So you have an economic model now among law firms that has lasted forever that is under siege. So what is that really going to mean to people over a long period of time with relatively flat demand, under siege on their economic model, the billable hour that has been under attack for a long period of time, the leverage that is shifted materially to clients. We were talking upstairs about the idea of the negative auction. Does anybody know what the negative auction is? It's when a company, usually a very big company for a portfolio of work, has a live auction and you keep driving the cost down. People are actually bidding it down as time goes on. So, and you have what's now going on in the market is deep segmentation among law firms. So you have law firms that will continue to make a fortune, and they are clearly those law firms that have some of them have a very deep legacy, and they very high, not that every law firm doesn't, but some more than others, a long legacy, very high standards, doing the most important work, and the most premium work where rates are not an issue. You have global firms like us, which are kind of a hybrid in many ways because of the extent and nature of our firm. We can have blended rates that are more, for different kinds of work that are, I would say, more economically attractive. But even those firms at the highest end are, if I were talking to the chairman, if the chairman of Paul Weiss were here, Brad would say to me, I'm worried about this. I'm worried about the model. What is the harbinger? What does this mean for us for the future? So that then brings you to a whole range of other questions, and I'll get to the global nature of this. It brings you to a whole range of other questions that senior leaders of law firms are now focused on. So the obvious things we're focused on are the changing demographics of who's going to law schools. We're focused on how do you manage the human capital, recognizing that you have shrunken demand. Who is really going to stick with it to be the next generation of partners and put up with a level of drudgery that is invariably true in any profession in which you're committed to the idea of learning the breadth and depth of the fundamentals. There is no doubt that it is not always fun. So one of the things, by the way, I'm a trustee of NYU Law School. One of the things that I object to very strenuously is how committed you are to the idea of practice. If you are not committed to the idea of practice, we are going to invest a fortune in your training that ultimately you will say after 3 to 5 years, I'm done with this. This isn't what I signed up for. I've paid off the debt, and I'm out of here, and I'm going to do what I really want to do. I, fortunately or unfortunately for you, I was also a hiring partner for a long period of time, so I've heard most of these speeches in the continuum. So the commitment to practice has changed our approach to the management of human capital. So what did law firms first do? Law firms followed law schools. So what did law schools do? Law schools figured out in their universities that they were a real profit center, and they changed the curriculum to, in my mind, be a more supercharged liberal arts program. People came, they were happy about it, but they weren't really, because they didn't know what else to do. They went to law school, you've heard it 100,000 times, and they went, right? Then all of a sudden they wake up and they say to themselves, I'm really in law school, what does all this mean? And they weren't really committed to the idea of practice. So what did the law firms do in the early stages? They made their training programs as much like law school as they possibly could. So what would appeal to very smart people like you? One, you wanted client contact very early on. You wanted responsibility very early on. You had very little depth as to the practice area, but you still wanted those things because most of the people that we're recruiting are people like you who believe, frankly, that you're entitled to it because of where you are and how you've achieved and the pyramid that you've climbed and all those other things. So what did the law firms do? What the law firms did was they created sliver lawyers. And what I mean by sliver lawyers is they created a situation where it became like school. They narrowed practice areas. They made you decide very early on as to specialties. You decided. They gave you material that was very much like what you were used to getting in school. You were really good at it. It was very comfortable. You always wanted to know how well you did. I mean, I get that. At law firms are a little bit different about how they tell you how well you do. Sometimes no news is good news. So, and you became very good at this. You ended up having client contact very early on. You ended up knowing the levels pretty early on. And then you put yourself in a position where you turned around after 3 years and you said, I am bored stiff. Because I haven't had the ability to sort of think outside the box and be a creative and more independent thinker. So what I would say to you in the context of whatever you're doing as far as recruiting is to at least for the summer or whatever it is, try to have some generalist experience. It will improve you as a practitioner. So now law firms have kind of flipped themselves on their heads for the 50th time about how to manage capital. Obviously there was a recession, hiring was way down, now hiring is probably a little more robust than it was before. Partnerships are shrinking, clearly going to continue to shrink. Certainly not going to grow at the level that they've grown before. So, I mean, if you want to know what 2020 is going to look like, that's not that far away. That's 5 years away-ish. That's sort of what it's going to look like. The good question is, and there's a very important law firm leaders summit that's run by Thomson Reuters and a consultant named Brad Hildebrand, and it's at Pebble Beach every year. And I'm on the planning committee. We were talking about what was the most important thing for law firm leaders. And one of the things that law firm leaders are now focused on is alternative work and technology and what the workspace is going to look like. So if you said to me, we're opening up a new building in Chicago in 2017, I think you will see a completely different open space environment. And I think you will see the technology continuing to grow in a completely different way than it is today. Now it's really a function of, are the emails okay and are we not being hacked? Or do we know that we already have been hacked? Is probably more accurately way to put it. So in those situations, we're really focused on what is going to appeal to you because we understand the world has changed. So we know, for example, that there are companies out there, and law firms are always the last to do this stuff. There are companies out there, including the CEO, who works from home 2 days a week. And because he doesn't want there to be a stigma, or she, I don't frankly know, a stigma associated with what it means to work at home. So if you think that we're kind of locked into the paralyzed world of what law firms were like in 1980 or 90, dream on. People are really, really focused on this because of the importance to all of us of trying to leave your institution in a better place than you found it. And that means trying to be on the edge of what's around the corner, looking around the corner, trying to really have a vision and not standing still. For a firm like Cravath is going to go on. Paul Weiss is going to go on. They're going to go on. But the disruptors in the market, which I include us among the disruptors in the market, are looking for a different way to build a global legal enterprise because we have to. We have to because of the level of diversity that's required, not only human diversity, but also geographic diversity. People don't work the same way in Thailand as they work in London. We can't charge the same way. So the level of depth that goes into the analysis of the models of what is now a huge institution is extremely high. So let me just give you a few other things. First of all, we all thought that in 2007, the legal spend in the world was going to move east. It was going to move to the Pan-Asian part of the world. That's turned out not to be true. Whether it'll be true in the next 5 years, depending upon what goes on in the People's Republic and the PRC, is a good question. We know, for example, that on the agenda for the 2015 Congress is the legal profession as a whole. I don't think that you can be a global law firm without having a very significant component of your firm being Pan-Asian. India is going to have to figure out someday what it's going to do with the bar. Right now, it's too problematic and too, frankly, it's too scary from a tax point of view to really sort of fight with them about it. So the whole issue of the emerging markets and how much of the legal spend that they get there is something that the global law firm focuses on. Global trade routes are changing. You can see it, you can read about it, you know it's true. How Asia and Latin America and Canada and everybody else and energy and all this other and all the other issues are going to evolve is something that becomes important to the global firm. Emerging middle class. Emerging middle class has two issues. One issue is the rule of law, which is not necessarily so obvious in a lot of the emerging countries, and the pivoting of very many of us towards Africa. We are, I can't tell you how much time that we spend on Africa, and there aren't that many practitioners around that have spent a substantial part of their career actually practicing in Africa and what that means. So I think you'll see, forgetting South Africa, I think you'll see in Eastern and some parts of Western Africa, law firms starting to build centers where they practice. Supply chain configurations have changed. There's big data and what all that means to us and how we operate with that. And there's this notion of reshoring. So you've seen, obviously, the American economy kind of outstrip most of the other economies in the world, with the exception of China, which has its own issues. So there's this whole idea of bringing manufacturing and all kinds of things back to it. What does that mean for a law firm? What does that mean for the idea of practice? What does that mean for things like you would be given up on the Rust Belt? What are the money centers going to be? If somebody had said to you 5 years ago, Palo Alto is a money center, you would have said, how does that work? No capital markets distribution there. There's an M&A practice. There are lots of people doing venture work. There are guys getting rich really quickly and girls getting rich really quickly, and so on and so forth. Palo Alto is a money center for us. It's not a money center because it has a huge distribution capacity, but the concentration of money doing deals even outside the tech or the life science space or whatever it is makes it a place that law firms really need to focus on. So you're focused on different money centers as the economies of the world evolve. I've talked about market segmentation. I've talked about globalization. You've heard probably a lot about alternative billing. I talked a little bit about the negative auction, cap fees, all kinds of things. You need to be, if you are a lawyer today and you're a leader, you need to be shoulder to shoulder with your client. You need to assume risk that you wouldn't have assumed before because the clients are demanding it. That means that I can't say to a client, well, you've got a busted deal, or we had a bad result in that litigation and we shouldn't share some of the pain. That isn't going to cut it. It clearly is not going to cut it. So alternative billing arrangements are something that's very important to sort of gaining market share with clients at a time when the growth model is so small. So we're all friends, right? But there's a pitched battle among law firm leaders to take market share away from each other every day. We know that we can take market share because we can do the same quality work for less money, and we will be able to outcompete some of the firms that don't have the geographic breadth that we have. Social networking, I think you know about. I've talked about the disruptors. One of the interesting things will be this whole technology and whether they're ultimately, we're talking about, particularly in some places where you have a regulatory issue, we're talking about the virtual law firm and what that exactly means. Digital tools, obviously there's a huge, after the Dewey LaBeouf debacle, there's a huge demand for transparency. User research and innovation will shape the client experience, I think. continued knowledge management continues to be something that's very, very important. So, in conclusion, what I would say is you've got to, if you're going to practice, say, this is where I am and where I want to be, as well as saying, this is what I should be doing and why I should be doing it. Secondly, I think I can give you sort of a little bit of practical advice. The client is the center of everything. To the extent that you think otherwise, don't do it. Don't practice. Clients are a pain in the neck, except if you do trust and estates. They tend not to be quite as much of a pain in the neck. But recognize that they're always right. You've got to be committed to the idea of practice. You've got to be thinking about what the next game is around the corner. And I think, and what I'll leave you with is, one of the most important things is to have, in the practice of law, a social agenda. I'll say two more things. What do I mean by a social agenda? We believe that one of the things that differentiates DLA from every other law firm is our commitment to charity and pro bono work. We've been enormously successful in doing that. You should have the same kind of commitment to pro bono and charity. The second thing I would say is, I view my job every day is to be the steward to make DLA a safe place to be. Not so much for all the kinds of reasons that you would think off the top of your head. We don't want there to be sexual harassment. We want it to be diverse. We want it to be all these things that are now part of common parlance. But the thing that keeps me up at night is existential and reputational risk, and the things that people do when you have a huge organization and the potential for rogue behavior. So what does that mean to me? Well, for most part, it doesn't mean a hell of a lot as far as the lawyers go, because I truly believe that lawyers will land on their feet. They're skilled, they've got a professional education, and so on and so forth. The people I'm most concerned about are the people who have spent 30 years at a law firm, who are receptionists, who take the mail around, who are the tea men or ladies, and for whom that law firm is they may be the principal breadwinners in their family, and that law firm is the principal economic unit in their life. And if I spend one day not thinking about that, I'm not doing the job that I should be doing. So all of these things that I've said go into where 2020 is going to be. I've given you a lot to, I think, absorb in a relatively short period of time. Happy to take questions or wherever, and don't be shy. And be as blunt, I will be blunt back, I promise you. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, you spoke a little bit about digital tools, and I know there's a huge conversion in the legal industry to being receptive of technology, and I imagine that's likely going to change over our lifetimes, especially the way we've grown up and the advent of technology, and that's permeating all other industries. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more towards, as a large global law firm, are you seeing startups and companies that are approaching you with new digital tools?
Yeah. There are two aspects to that. One aspect is there will be new technology, and it will impact how we work. There's no question about that. One of the interesting things that people have raised is the whole idea of how do you pay for it, right? Law firms finance themselves through capital contributions of their partners. The capital spend for what you're talking about in order for us to, before prices to be on the cutting edge of what it's going to be, is a fortune. And it's not really possible to tax the partners, even in an enterprise like us, to do that. God bless you, whoever that was. So we're focused on how do you pay for it, and we're focused on when do you do it. Because the idea, you can't disrupt the systems just because it's sort of a new idea, right? You have to kind of spend the time, watch it closely, and then reach a conclusion when it reaches an economic inflection point that this is the time to move to do it. Secondly, you can't disrupt your capital structure while you're doing this. Otherwise, you're going to have people headed for the doors because they've invested loads of capital in the firm and they expect someday to get it back. So there's a sort of a nice little conundrum that people that are continuing to work on. But the financing of law firms is a big part of what we're all focused on because, as many of you know, there's no, largely on an equity basis, there's no third-party financing of law firms allowed except in Australia and to a lesser extent
I'd say
UK.
not yet.
Not yet. Well, the question is whether you want it.
Yeah, that's a big
I mean,
question. But you
I've
just
been
gave a pretty
I've
good
been approached. I mean, I've been approached by a hedge fund
answer.
who said to me, "We'll put $100 million into your business, and you can pay a dividend, or you can do whatever you want to your existing partners. What we want is an 8% return off the top." Not so sure I want to do that. Not only do I not want to do that because it disrupts the system and it changes the system, but remember, every year you have a new partnership. So you can't be in a position as a law firm leader to give any group of people a windfall because the group of people constantly changes. So while it's a good idea, it's a different idea. It's you can see the evolution of sort of financial engineering and people thinking about it. By the same token, there are now hedge funds out there that are willing to give law firms huge amounts of money as the funders of litigation, whether it's mass tort, whatever kind of litigation it is, simply because they believe that they're going to get an outsized return by the verdict or the judgment or whatever ends up, or the settlement, whatever happens. So the financing of this is a big piece of this too. Yes, sir.
Do you see any role for these global law firms or your global law firm in back channel negotiations, mediations of persistent conflicts? Like, I mean, you mentioned that you were talking to the president of Colombia,
Yeah.
who had been negotiating with FARC.
Yeah.
Do you see any role for you or people in your organization negotiating or helping to negotiate with FARC, or, for example, getting involved in the problems of the Ukraine or of Syria, for example?
Yeah,
Hypothetically.
so let me talk about that a little bit. So we are probably the most aggressive in having a government affairs practice that goes to these kinds of issues. So the chairman emeritus of the firm is Senator Mitchell, right? So when forgetting, I'm not making light of it, but forgetting Good Friday, the Good Friday Accord and how long that took him, I mean, he left the firm for 2 years really to be the special envoy to the Middle East. And our involvement in all of the geographies very much has a political component to it. But here's a good question. If you were picking a side to be on in the Middle East right now, what would you do? I mean, we already represent the Qataris. We represent Al Jazeera. We have offices in the Emirates. We represent some of the biggest players in the Emirates. We're in Saudi, and we're in Bahrain, and we're in Oman too. So the political, and people have said to us, well, you need to be in Jordan and so on and so forth because it's the Switzerland of the Middle East. I mean, so yes, we are involved in it, and we have a very significant relationship with former Secretary of Defense Cohn, and his involvement reflects on us. So whether it's rewriting constitutions in parts of Central Europe, I mean, there's a whole range of stuff that we do.
So you asked me a question. So I mean, I think it's I would say that it's a question of who you're talking to and who is listening to you. And if I were, I think the part that needs to be engaged at this point is the Russians. Because rather than,
Yeah.
saber rattling at them, I think, and I thought for some time, that they hold the key to Syria
Right.
and,
Right, so we represent Gazprom. It's not surprising that we represent Gazprom. And you can't, I would say part of the answer to your question is you can't forget why you came, right? The global law firm makes hard decisions about substantive legal issues and substantive policy issues about what side that we can be on. But sometimes events like what's going on in the Middle East now, as between the countries themselves, gets ahead of us. And then we find ourselves locked. So I take your point. I certainly take your point. But it's not so easy even for a global law firm or even for George Mitchell to sort of knock on the door and say, Vladimir, I'd like to come in and have a little chat with you about fixing this problem in the Ukraine, right? I think it goes without saying, and without saying any more about it, and I won't answer any questions about this, is that the growth of DLA, as well as its global framework, has put us in situations where we have done some back channeling to solve political problems. But it's not something we're going out there and putting in our marketing material. Yes, sir.
You mentioned UK, the UK and Australia.
Yeah.
With respect to the reform of the profession that
Yeah.
has taken place there because of the regulatory changes. And when do you think that is going? Is the same is going to happen in the US as well?
Long time. I mean,
I think less time than, look, it was on the agenda for Ethics 2020, which they just debated. Some version of it will come here. And you know what'll bring it here? Is when some successful law firm in the UK takes $100 million private equity or hedge fund investment and invests in new technologies and starts out-competing US law firms. It will then change.
And small second question: how big an economy has to be in order for a firm like DLA to decide to set up a presence there? I'm talking about places where you're present.
well, a good example is the Czech Republic, right? 10 million people. I mean, we're the #1 firm in the Czech Republic. I think part of it is what we perceive to be what our global reach needs to be in the various regions of the world. I mean, would we open up an office in the Caymans? I doubt it. Or Trinidad or something like that? No, I doubt that. But the places that can be knitted together with the rest of the framework are places that we would consider. So, for example, presuming that I don't become a liar to President Santos, we'll look at the rest of the crescent. So will we open up an office in Peru? Will we open up an office in Chile? Good question. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of law firms nowadays are focusing on women's initiatives in an attempt to retain female talent. The big law firm of 2020, what do you envision or how do you see it?
Okay, so we have a women, I could have teed you up for that question. So we had a women's summit, which started about 3 years ago in Chicago last week. There were 250 to 300 women GCs in the room. There were 8 men, including me, in the room. It's rare for me to be in a situation where people are talking about me like I wasn't there. But what it goes to is sort of the power of the changing demographics of the industry, of the industry legal system. Many more women, much more diversity, much more concerned about diverse issues, family issues, and so on and so forth. The entire time of this session was not spent talking about Valerie Jarrett spoke, and she was interviewed by Mara Eliason, who's a public radio, pretty senior correspondent. They spent the entire time talking about not legal issues, but women's issues associated with families. And what they were really focused on was sexual assault. I'm telling you this, sexual assault on college campuses, and how you talk to people at a very early stage. So one woman got up and she said, "I'm the mother of 2 boys. How do I talk to my sons about it?" So Valerie Jarrett turned to her and said to her, "How old are your sons?" So she said, 3 and 5 months. So Valerie said to her, "Well, I think you maybe have some time, but you'll have a lot of time to work on it." Similarly, to your point, Valerie Jarrett said the most important thing, or she thinks one of the most important achievements of President Obama's administration has been the appointment of Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan. A woman stood up and said to her, "Do you realize that neither of them are mothers and neither of them have families?" And Valerie Jarrett, in an uncharacteristically honest moment, honestly, said, "Hadn't really thought about that." That is, I mean, the President of the United States appointing an Associate Justice to the Supreme Court and not taking into account the vast majority of family life that goes on, or not thinking about it, and his senior policy advisor, who's a woman, focus on it. So the short answer to your question is we have so much more work to do on this subject, even though we've come miles. But we're very focused on it. Look, a good example is the statistics. This statistic. We have a woman managing partner in the U.S., Stacia Kelly. She used to be the general counsel of AIG. She's involved with Freddie Mac. She's been Sears. She's been around the block a lot. Very important woman in the general counsel environment, now managing partner of DLA in the U.S., member of the global board, important part of the management team. We're focused on this all the time in a way that other firms either can't or won't allow. And honestly, when I grew up, the women that became partners, people said all the time they were guys. They were prepared to do what guys did. That world has moved. That world has moved way away. So the answer is, we've made a lot of progress, but it's still not where we need to be.
I think we have time for one more.
One more? Okay, we'll give you 2. Can they have 2 more?
Okay.
2 more quickly. Go.
So, assuming that billing is the heart of what the lawyer does, which is, let's say, the extraction of fee from the client, is the heart of our practice generally, as lawyers, then, without going into controversy. A firm like DLA Piper is essentially, to my mind, a Walmart. It's everywhere, and it's driving the prices down. It's a race to the bottom, in a sense. So from the perspective of a protectionist economy like India, these bunch of lawyers over there are making a lot of money.
Yeah.
And associates can afford Beamers and Audis within 3 years of the practice. Now, in 2020, a firm like DLA Piper is creating a broad middle class, but not enough rich lawyers. So I'm talking pure economics here.
Well, first of all, your predicate is wrong. Your predicate was that the most important thing for a lawyer is to extract the fee from the client?
To charge the client.
Okay. The most important thing for a lawyer is to do high quality work at very high standards so that your ethics and values are never questioned, right? Never compromised. We're not at a race to the bottom because actually our rates have risen over the period of the last 5 years and they've stuck in our realization. So while I understand your point, the factual predicates aren't right. Yes, sir.
You spoke about the specialized sliver of
Yeah.
lawyers.
Mhm.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on that versus like the free market system.
I grew up in a free market system, and I think I'm a usually better lawyer because of it. And I think it's very important as you get into practice that you watch economic changes and you pivot. I'll tell one quick story. So the financial crisis happens and a partner comes and talks to me and she says to me, I really love doing IPOs. And I said, there are no IPOs. She said, what would you do? So I said to her, well, what I would do is I would start to read credit agreements and indentures because there's going to be lots of restructuring and so on and so forth. And I would try to become because you're not going to become a bankruptcy lawyer, you'll become an out of court restructuring lawyer, because that's where the hedge funds are headed, because it's just a negative form of private equity, right? It's just another way of controlling assets. Have this whole long, nice lunch. She turns around at the end of the lunch and she says to me, I really like doing IPOs. So you have to focus on pivoting your own practice as the economics in the world change. Thank you all very much.
Roger, thank you.